Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The noon heat sat heavy over Fort Ashland training grounds in Texas, the kind that makes the air waver above the tarmac and pushes sweat out before you take a second step. Trucks rumbled past the motor pool, a forklift beeped near the supply bay, and somewhere downrange a line of shots cracked in steady intervals. Madison Callahan stepped out of a dull green van and shut the door with a clean push. Boots hit concrete. No hurry, no show. Her ACU sleeves were rolled tight, name tape neat, patrol cap low enough to shade her eyes. She didn't scan for an audience, she already knew there was one. You can feel it on a base when a rumor has legs. A few soldiers on break drifted toward Bay 7, cups of coffee dangling from their fingers. Sailors in dark tops and tan boots angled the same direction. A pair of instructors paused outside the armory window, pretending to read a sign while keeping their line of sight open. Special assessment. That phrase had been moving through Fort Ashland since breakfast, picking up detail as it went. Some said there was brass on the catwalk. Some said Navy had stacked a hand-picked four-man team and wanted to prove a point. Some said the staff sergeant from the Army side would walk in light and walk out lighter. Maddie crossed the quad and didn't change pace. The armory door thumped, cool air spilled out, and she stepped through. Inside, racks of M4s stood locked, pistols in labeled bins, checked and counted like always. At the counter, the Navy 4 were already there, leaning their weight in different ways that said the same thing. Lieutenant Brandon Cross stood center, tall, tan, combat shirt clean, muzzle discipline absolute even while he set the tone with a friendly voice sharpened by edge. To his right, Chief Marcus Doyle had the easy posture of a man who trusts mass and reach to answer most questions. On Cross's left, Kyle Reddick's grin hovered just short of a smirk, fingers drumming a fast rhythm on the steel lip. At the end, Jason Keene shifted his stance in small cycles, knees soft, eyes quick, too much energy for the stillness of a counter. None of them were loud. They didn't have to be. Their kit made the argument for them, rifles zeroed, sidearms snug, blades strapped high, comms checked, slings set to their preferred length. Maddie's gaze didn't hang on them. She noted positions, holster angles, boot wear, the usual quick inventory, then looked past the racks toward the big interior window. Up on the observation deck, behind a wire mesh, a single figure stood with his hands light on the rail. White shirt, khaki slacks, posture that never lost its lines. Colonel Stephen Hartwell. He didn't signal, didn't nod, didn't even shift his weight. His presence was the only cue she needed that this was more than a drill on a slow day. Around the armory a murmur rose and folded back down as the warrant officer cleared his throat and read the scenario. Inter-service container run, Bay 7. Objective, cross, control, and clear. Timing official. Army representative will surrender all weapons prior to entry. Navy team proceeds fully equipped. All safety rules in effect, strikes controlled, taps respected. Questions. There weren't any that mattered. Cross eased off the counter and let the room hear his best version of good sportsmanship. "We'll keep it clean," he said, like it was a favor. Reddick smiled into the floor. Keene's jaw moved like he was chewing on the clock that hadn't started. Doyle didn't look at anyone, he watched Maddie the way big men who've seen a lot of fights watch for telltale flinch. She offered none. She unbuckled her holster strap and placed her pistol on the stainless surface, then unshouldered the rifle she'd carried to the building, checked it clear out of habit, and set it beside the sidearm. Knife came last, clipped free and laid down without any spin. The clack of steel on steel traveled farther than it should have, and outside the door a few more bodies drifted in to line the wall. The warrant officer signed a line, closed the log, and jerked his chin toward the bay. That was the whole ceremony. No speeches, no posturing. If there was theater, it was coming from the crowd. Maddie stepped back out into the heat and walked the short strip to Bay 7. The doors were rolled up high enough to swallow a truck, shadows pooling from the threshold to 3 container lengths in. Inside, columns of corrugated steel formed a mapped chaos, narrow alleys, dead ends, laddered stacks, catwalk in sections, lights failing in an every third pattern that guarantees uneven glare. The floor was patched with rubber in certain turns where trainees tended to slip, and the smell was a mix of oil, dust, and cleaner that never quite caught all of it. She stood one boot inside the line and let her eyes set to the light. From the far side, the 4 sailors moved with a practiced calm, helmets nodding as they checked corners they could see from here. Cross lifted his left hand in a lazy half-wave toward the deck above, then set it back on his rifle. Doyle rolled his shoulders once. Reddick adjusted a strap and looked like he wanted a camera. Keene bounced twice, then forced himself still. On the catwalk Hartwell didn't move at all. The warrant officer's whistle dangled from a cord, but it wasn't in his mouth yet. He walked the quick safety checks, confirmed med kit and observers at stations, and said the time would be official to the second. People stopped whispering. You could feel the room settle into the kind of quiet that happens before a starting gun. Maddie slid one step deeper into the shadow and lifted her chin just enough to read the line of fluorescent tubes. She marked which ones hummed louder and which ones flickered. In a place like this, light lies and sound tells the truth. You track cadence, you map weight, you read the difference between a sling scrape and a boot scuff. She didn't flex her hands or roll her neck. She already knew where her balance lived. Cross glanced back once at his stack and said something on comms that didn't carry. Reddick's grin flattened. Keene's eyes sharpened. Doyle exhaled through his nose and made a small adjustment to his stance that said he'd decided how he wanted the first contact to feel. At the edge of the bay, more uniforms filled the doorway. Some Army greens, some Navy blues, an Air Force tech in a gray tee with a grease mark on the shoulder. No one laughed now. Whatever had started as a bet in a chow line was a real test with a clock. The whistle lifted, silver flashed, and then paused. The warrant officer looked up at the deck. Hartwell gave nothing back. That was the go. The whistle cut and echoed off steel, and the Navy 4 flowed toward the May's mouth like it belonged to them. Maddie's heel slid half an inch to set her line, and she was gone into the nearest seam, one body length into the first lane, turning left on the second panel crease where the rubber mat ended. The crowd leaned forward, but she didn't see them. The only audience that mattered was the one man on the rail and the 4 men whose plan assumed gear would decide. Outside, the sun stayed brutal. Inside, the game reset to the only rules that count: respect the ground, read the opponent, and don't let the room tell you who you are. The heat outside became a memory. Here it was steel, light, and angles stacked to fool anyone who trusted eyesight alone. Maddie let the first echo bloom, the 4-man cadence of Cross's stack entering left lane wide, rifles cradled low, sling buckles making that faint metallic kiss when they brush corrugation. She mapped it fast, Cross steady up front, Doyle's weight landing a hair heavier and slower, Reddick's footwork almost too clean to be natural, and Keene still bleeding nervous energy into little taps he couldn't mute. The fluorescent fixtures popped in an uneven rhythm, and in those gaps the maze hid pockets of darker air that swallowed silhouettes a half-second quicker than a normal hallway would. She slid along a rib in the wall, shoulders nearly grazing cold paint, counting steps in halves so her breath sank to the room instead of to her heart. The Navy 4 pushed deeper, voices clipped on comms, hunting a shape they assumed would run. She refused to feed that script. She shadowed on a parallel lane separated by 2 container widths, always offset at 45 degrees so the muzzle cones they threw forward left her peripheral intact. The first turn narrowed to a choke where rubber matting ended and bare steel took over, a place where sound sharpens and feet betray more than faces. Keene hit it and let his heel scrape just enough to right his position for anyone fluent in these corridors. Maddie pressed a palm to a dent the size of a fist, a landmark from some other team's mistake, then cut a diagonal through a service seam that barely looked like a path until you committed to it. She emerged 2 panels ahead of the stacks line, not in front, not behind, adjacent, where nerves fray. Cross called a silent hand signal no one below the catwalk could see. Doyle's response was a small shift that said he'd hold flank and dare contact to go through him. Reddick rolled a shoulder like a showman itching for a camera that wasn't there. The crowd at the bay mouth hushed to that thick quiet that settles before a first crash. Hartwell didn't move. His stillness pulled everything tighter. Maddie suppressed the urge to take the nearest opening. The maze trains you to lunge, discipline trains you to wait for the lunge to write the opening you actually want. She aimed for the tail, the softest seam in any formation, and let the second stretch just enough to turn confidence into impatience. The corridor ahead of Keen kinked left into a blind S-curve where a warped panel had created a hook most people never notice until it steals their stride. She set herself opposite that hook and slid 1 boot length back so her center would meet his center as momentum crested. Cross cleared the first bend, Doyle flowed through with mass under control, Reddick skimmed the line with that fixed grin, and Keen, chasing distance he hadn't earned, let the sling kiss that metal lip. The hiccup was smaller than a blink, but in tight quarters a blink is a canyon. Maddie went. Not explosive, not dramatic, pure economy. Left hand clamped Keen's barrel just forward of the handguard, pinning the muzzle against the wall before it could sweep, right forearm chopped under his triceps to break the elbow's integrity, hips pivoting to feed his own forward drift into the container with a resonant, low, humiliating clang. Air left his lungs, reflex pulled at the rifle, she rotated with it, bled the force, and stripped the weapon free in a motion as old as mat time. No shots, no shouts, just the mechanical punctuation of metal changing owners. Reddick spun a fraction, instinct dragging the muzzle toward motion, and Cross's left hand snapped a command that kept him from firing a training blank into the wall out of pure ego. Doyle planted and started to cut back, big man moving like a swinging gate with discipline instead of anger. Maddie didn't stand there to admire the transfer. She let Keen tumble to a knee, tapped the captured rifle's mag well with 2 fingers to confirm seating the way muscle memory always does, then slid the buttstock across Reddick's shin as he turned, a low, mean sweep that doesn't show well on camera but steals structure from anyone whose base rides too high. His knee buckled, not catastrophic, just enough to murder smoothness. Cross tried to reknit the shape by yanking the variable most leaders reach for, tempo, but the maze punishes tempo without control. He surged and lost the whisper of Keen's calms behind him. Hartwell finally tilted his head the slightest degree, as if noting a ledger entry. The observers along the wall had stopped breathing in unison the way crowds do when they realize what they're witnessing is not a fluke but a sequence. Doyle arrived first, filling the lane with mass and intent, one hand instinctively dropping toward the knife on his thigh before Doctrine reeled it back. Maddie stepped offline by inches, never offering him square contact, never giving a straight surface to hit. The rifle wasn't a gun now, it was geometry, a lever that lived where wrists and balance make bad neighbors. She feinted a retreat to bait a bull rush and saw the tell, Doyle's shoulders rose a fraction, breath up, weight loading to drive. She didn't take it yet. Overcommitment tastes better when it's fully cooked. Cross, sensing his rear unraveling, cut right to seal a lane she wasn't in, and Reddick, recovering, tried for the mirror move on the opposite side, trusting Keen to find his feet and re-anchor. Keen's hands came up, training alive enough to slap her thigh in the universal tap that says, "I'm out," even in a pride-killing moment. She released pressure without ceremony, let him live to process it, then disappeared again, slipping between a pair of containers stacked with a lip you could vault if you were willing to skin a knuckle. The clock didn't care about knuckles. The room shifted with her. Now the Navy 4 were a 3+ ghost, the plan bleeding small leaks that grow into floods if you don't find a valve fast. Cross tried a hard stop, the kind that resets a team by shoving every perception back to 0, but the maze eats resets when the opponent is already writing the rhythm. Maddie ran a fingertip along a seam to feel vibration, picked up Doyle's tread on the deck by the heavier report it made, and cut perpendicular to him so his next turn would carry him into a junction where two sight lines overlapped like scissor blades. She didn't need to win there yet, just to plant a thought. Reddick reappeared in her peripheral, eyes bright with the anger of a man who thinks humiliation can be outrun, and she starved him of the chase, dropping into shadow and letting him commit to empty air. The crowd at the door shifted their weight as one organism. On the catwalk, Hartwell's hands never tightened on the rail. The warrant officer watched his stopwatch with the detachment of a judge who already trusts the math. The conflict had arrived, not in a single blow, but in the way certainty had quietly left one side and settled, calm as a coin in a pocket, on the other. That certainty, calm as a coin in a pocket, sat with Maddie as she let the maze breathe and told herself not to cash it too fast. Keene was out of the equation, sucking air and blinking the way people do when a wall has reminded them that balance is rented, not owned. Cross tried to stretch the team into a longer shape to cover gaps, but long shapes bleed in tight corridors. Reddick came hunting with his grin hammered flat, rifle high, shoulders too square for a lane this narrow. She read the set of his feet, heels a touch loud, toes pointed a hair outward, and met him with the kind of economy that doesn't look like a fight until it's already over. A half step inside his muzzle, palm slicing to the gas block to lock the barrel, forearm riding up under his chin to take away posture, hips turned so his weight went where she wanted, off his base and down. He grabbed at the rifle like it was a life raft and she let him have the illusion, rolling the buttstock across his forearm just above the wrist to numb his grip, then threading her right arm under his to seal a tight blood choke that respected training rules without surrendering control. No scuffle, no drama, just pressure in the right place. His hand slapped out against her thigh, 1, 2, 3, and she released clean, guiding him to the mat with a short push that kept him from bouncing back in on instinct. Cross heard the tap and didn't need eyes to translate the meaning. His pace changed by a quarter beat, the way competent leaders do when the plan has shed a limb. Doyle didn't slow. He committed, big and direct, trusting mass to solve what geometry had complicated. Maddie refused to meet him where his size meant more. She cut an angle that put his shoulder past her hip, slid the captured rifle along his forearm as a lever to foul his grip, and let him blow through a space she had vacated half a heartbeat earlier. The crowd near the door stirred and then stilled again, a hush that snapped tight as they realized she hadn't scored a takedown there on purpose. She wanted Doyle to move the way a gate swings in wind, back and forth through the same hinge, because repetition writes a map and a map writes an end. Cross, to his credit, tried to compress the arena to his advantage, shifting to a T-intersection where he could control two lanes with one body and an alert muzzle. He posted on the balls of his feet, sling set tight, eyes cutting in steady arcs, voice a low thread on comms that didn't betray frustration. Good posture, good doctrine. Maddie answered with the thing doctrine hates, uncertainty. She made sound where there was no body and hid body where sound should have been, dragging a fingertip across corrugation far enough right to pull Cross's gaze, then sliding left through a seam that looked like a dead end until it didn't. Doyle re-entered hard, breath a touch heavier, knife handle flashing temptation at his thigh before rules reeled him back again. She gave him a target, just a shoulder, just a blink, and when he lunged, she didn't counter, she redirected, palm on sleeve, hips pivoted, letting his velocity sketch the throw for her. Not the full finish, she saved that, just enough to spike his confidence a notch lower and put him on a knee with a grunt he tried to swallow. The stopwatch in the warrant officer's hand ticked loud to anyone who understands how time behaves in fights like this. Hartwell didn't move, but the tilt of his head said he'd filed another line under predictable choices. Keene, still kneeling, pushed himself upright and steadied on a container, his eyes finally telling the truth his breath had already told. He was done for this run. Reddick rolled to a seat, one hand on his neck, anger cooling into focus that might be useful later, just not now. Cross kept the only play he had, control what you can see, anticipate what you can't, and sliced the pie on his nearest corner with clean elbows and a muzzle that never drifted. Maddie treated the rifle in her hands like a tool instead of a totem. She didn't fire blanks, didn't point for show, she used stock and rail and gravity to solve problems. She ghosted past a ladder rung welded onto a stack and banked that image for later, then dropped into a lane that would intersect Cross's position at an oblique picked for how it forced him to choose wrong if he chose fast. He didn't rush it. Smart. He waited for the silhouette he thought he'd built in his head. She gave him something different, a quick shadow at calf height, a sound behind him a beat late, a breath where breath shouldn't be. He reoriented, the sling brushed a burr of metal left by some long-ago impact, and that tiny hitch, less than a blink, again, opened the window she wanted. She slid inside range, stripped his muzzle offline with a short, ugly twist that's all wrist and intent, kicked the rifle 2 panels down where it skittered harmless and loudly, then locked his sidearm where it lived with a thumb wedge that froze the draw halfway. He tried to turn his hips to throw her off the gun, and she dropped her weight just enough to make rotation cost more than it paid, then stepped out instead of finishing him there. It wasn't the moment yet. Leave the leader upright long enough to burn his attention on the wrong problem while the big man burns his gas chasing a phantom. Doyle came again, sweat blooming at his collar, patience gone. She fed him a straight line and then shaved off an inch at the last instant so his shoulder met air and his boots met uncertain friction. The throw was right there, the clean arc that would plant him flat and end the question, but she still let it pass. One more turn. One more repeat. Make the lesson set so deep his body won't forget what it did wrong when the whistle blows. The observers along the wall were silent in that way people get when they realize they're watching a standard being written, not a stunt. The maze, cruel as always, kept offering false confidence at every bend, and Cross kept paying small tolls to keep the team from breaking into panic. He didn't panic. He recalculated. Maddie respected that enough to give him the courtesy of a real finish when it was time. Not yet. She slid back to the ladder rung she'd clocked and put her left foot 2 steps up, just enough height to change the angle on the next contact, then waited for the sound of Doyle's boots to hit the junction she had pre-selected 3 minutes earlier when the run began. He hit it on schedule, men like him always do because discipline is predictability when you haven't learned the other kind, and she turned, caught his sleeve again, turned her hips like a door on a hinge, and let his own momentum hang him in the air long enough for gravity to do the rest. Not the hard slam, just a decisive plant on the mat that took wind and options together. She didn't pin him. She relieved him of his sidearm with a motion smoother than memory, then stepped back into shadow as the whistle stayed mercilessly silent and the crowd realized the clock was still writing. Cross, alone for the first time in his head even if bodies still moved on the periphery, drew breath through his nose and set his stance for the piece that mattered. Maddie let the captured pistol feel its weight in her hand, safe and neutral like the range demanded, then set it on the deck as if to say the tool was never the point. The point was space, timing, and the humbling fact that rooms don't care who you are. In that hum, certainty moved again, and it moved with her. Maddie eased one breath, felt the room's edges settle, and let the maze tell her where the last hinge lived. Keen was a ghost against a wall, Reddick sat cooling the fire that had burned too hot, Doyle lay planted and learning the kind of lesson you don't forget, and Cross stood alone at the junction he'd chosen on purpose, 2 lanes to watch, 1 body to hold them, muzzle steady, feet right, mind alive. He didn't blink. Leaders like him don't search for excuses. They search for angles, and the angle he wanted was patience, make her come to a controlled corner and trade honest reps. She refused the trade. She gave him a flicker of motion where a person wouldn't be, low and off speed, the kind of bait novices bite and professionals ignore. He ignored it, good eyes splitting the pie at a measured rate, shoulders quiet, elbows in, sling tight enough that the rifle lived as part of him. She noted the micro-hitch in his left shoe where tread had frayed from ladder drills and banked it the way she banked light and sound. Then she took him somewhere doctrine doesn't love, the half-space between lanes where sound travels wrong and time bends in little dishonest ways. A palm along corrugation 2 panels back wrote a false path in his head, the whisper of a boot on rubber wrote a second, the truth slid through the slit between them. He shifted his weight to answer the first and brushed that ruined sling burr again, so slight a touch you couldn't see it, just feel how it stole the glide out of his next step. That was the window. She didn't explode, she entered, quiet and direct, both hands on the rifle not like a worshipper but like a carpenter, pushing the muzzle a fist-width off-line and keeping it there with boring, relentless pressure while her hips stole his base at a 45 he couldn't love. He tried to ride it out, turned his hips to keep the pistol alive as an option, and her thumb wedged against the holster in a way every mat rat knows, turned the draw into a stall, no theatrics, just denial. He tried to reset the distance with a shoulder check that would have bullied a lighter opponent. She swallowed it, dropped a half-inch, and let the contact travel through instead of into her. The rifle skittered when she kicked it away, not far, just enough to make retrieval a bad decision, and his right hand made the choice a good leader makes in tight spaces: abandon gear, save posture. She respected it, didn't punish the courage with a cheap shot. She gave him the clean version, the one you can put in a manual. Wrist control to break the gun hand's dreams, forearm pressure that turns the neck into a suggestion instead of a command, knee check that erases the idea of planting for a throw. His mind tried a third option, punch the air out of the scenario with speed, and she took speed away with angles. He reached a tipping moment, commit hard and lose clean or drag it out and lose messy. He committed. She caught the commitment, turned her hips like a door again, but this time she finished because this was the point the room had been walking toward since the whistle. Cross left his feet for the breath of a heartbeat, not a showy arc, just the honest physics of mass plus motion hitting a hinge. The deck came up, his breath left in a short grunt, his hand, disciplined even there, tapped in that crisp, unambiguous way that says he knows the rule and he respects it. She released as clean as she'd taken control, stepped back, and let the space fill with the sound that always follows a real finish: nothing. No cheers, no groans, just the held-breath silence of a room recalculating itself. The warrant officer's whistle carved that silence sharp and final, a single high note that bounced off steel and landed like a stamp. 6-9 seconds, someone near the door whispered, as if speaking above a murmur would break something fragile. Reddick wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the floor like it could tell him why it had gone this way. Keene's chest rose and fell in smaller waves, the humiliation already turning into a heat he'd carry to his next rep. Doyle rolled to an elbow and stayed there, big man's eyes locked not on Maddie, not on his own men, but on the exact spot where momentum had betrayed him. Maddie safed the pistol she'd taken and set it on the deck beside Cross, not as a taunt, not as a trophy, just to put the truth back where it belonged. Up on the catwalk Hartwell finally moved. It wasn't dramatic. He set both hands on the rail, lifted his weight with the kind of economy that never wastes a joint, and started down the graded stairs. The sound of boots on steel came slow and even, ringing through the space in a rhythm that felt like a metronome for discipline. The crowd parted without thinking, forming a line through the middle of Bay 7 that nobody ordered and everybody obeyed. He reached the floor and walked past scattered gear and scuffed rubber and 4 men who had just learned the price of certainty spent in the wrong place. He stopped 3 paces from Maddie. No smile. No ceremony. Just the faintest upward pull at one corner of his mouth, the kind of acknowledgement people work whole careers to see once. "Didn't think I'd see you ride it that clean again," he said, voice low enough that those farthest back had to lean in with their ears. He let the words rest, then turned his head toward the team. "Respect the room," he said, and the phrase filled the bay like a verdict. "Respect the opponent. You went in geared to the teeth and forgot the ground was armed too." Cross stood, nodded once, didn't argue. Leaders don't. Hartwell's gaze traveled the container walls, the catwalk joints, the lights that had lied and the angles that had told the truth. "This is not theater," he added, quieter. "It's the part of the job that keeps people alive when the script collapses." He gave no speech about shame, no lecture about arrogance, no dramatic punishments. He just looked at the 4 men and said, "You'll restore that bay to inspection ready today." Not cruel, precise. The kind of correction that teaches hands and lungs what the mind missed. He pivoted back to Maddie for one more second, eyes carrying a history neither of them needed to narrate, and then stepped aside, ceding the space without fanfare. She didn't raise her arms or look for approval. She retrieved nothing she hadn't already returned, adjusted her sleeve, and walked into the sunlight, the heat grabbing hold again like a living thing. At the threshold, the crowd exhaled as if a room had opened inside their chests. The story began to move in low voices before she cleared the door, 4 armed, 1 unarmed, 69 on the clock, and by the time she reached the armory counter the rumor had become a shape with edges that would be hard to sand off. Outside, the Texas glare turned everything high contrast, but inside Bay 7 the colors had changed in a different way. Confidence had shifted addresses. The maze sat exactly as it had an hour earlier, same dents, same scuffs, same flickering tubes, yet none of it was the same. What had just happened would live in that steel longer than chalk lines or tape marks. And up on the catwalk, the echo of a single measured descent lingered, boots on grate, certainty reset, a standard set down where anyone could find it if they were willing to earn it. By late afternoon, Bay 7 looked different not because the steel had changed but because the people inside it had. Cross stacked mops and rags with the same care he gave to his kit, set a pace, and didn't let anyone slack. Doyle hauled buckets without a word, big shoulders rolling under the weight like penance done properly, every pass of the brush over rubber matting tracked the lane where his momentum had betrayed him. Reddick scrubbed the scuffed corners where his base went soft, jaw set, grin gone, listening to the squeak of wet cloth like it was a class he should have taken earlier. Keane worked the lower plates, slow at first, then steadier as breath and embarrassment evened out. He kept touching that panel lip with the back of his knuckles, a private reminder that slings and speed don't forgive the same mistakes. The crowd had thinned but didn't disappear. A few soldiers from the motor pool leaned on the doorframe, not gloating, just learning. 2 range NCOs stood quiet, counting heads and angles with their eyes the way instructors do when they're stealing an idea for the morning brief. Hartwell didn't hover, he passed through once, let his gaze sweep, and left them to the work, correction handled, lesson owned. Outside, the Texas light threw long rectangles across the quad. Inside, the rhythm of cleaning replaced the earlier drum of boots on steel. Maddie kept her day moving like the drill had been a calendar item between 2 others. She turned in the rifle she'd carried to the armory, signed the same line she always signed, and slid out with a nod that meant exactly nothing to anyone who needed spectacle to stay interested. In the mess hall, the story started to crystallize. It lost the fluff and kept the facts: 1 soldier unarmed, 4 sailors fully kitted, 69 on the clock, whistle up and whistle down. The rest, the parts people tried to dress with adjectives, fell away when it met professionals. The motor pool picked it up next. A mechanic wiped grease off his palms and told it straight to a buddy at the tool cage, hand sketching the moment a sling caught a burr, the clean plant at the junction, the tap that meant respect for rules not surrender of pride. By evening, you could hear it at the far end of the barracks hallway in the low tone troops use when they're talking about something they actually intend to use later. No one asked Maddie for a speech. She wouldn't have given one anyway. She hit the gym, worked a simple circuit, wrapped a light stretch, and walked the perimeter path until sunset took the edge off the heat. On the observation deck, an instructor traced a finger along the railing and marked with tape the 3 sight lines that had mattered most. The tape wasn't for show, it was for tomorrow's brief. Hartwell sat alone in his office long enough to write 5 lines on a legal pad: respect terrain, deny assumptions, manage tempo, force choices, finish clean. He tucked the pad in a drawer without labeling it. He didn't need a program name to know a standard when he saw one. The first formal ripple hit the next morning. A training schedule update slid into inboxes with a new block listed under close quarters adaptation, container parameters, Kestrel. No attached speech, no clip art, just bullet points: start disadvantaged, define acoustic map, break formation at the tail, protect posture, prioritize finish over flare. At 0900, Cross and his team stood on the catwalk while a mixed group of fresh faces and seasoned hands listened to an NCO lay out the run. Cross didn't flinch when the NCO used his lane as the cautionary example. Leaders who survive in the long run know that clarity now saves pain later. When it was his turn to talk, he didn't pander. Control the piece you own, he said. If you lose that, call it and reset. We didn't. Doyle stepped in with something that mattered more than a confession. If you think size wins corners, the corner will teach you otherwise. Fix your feet first. Reddick kept it short, don't chase anger. It doesn't pay. Keene said the line that stuck with the younger ones, rear security isn't boring, it's survival. No one clapped. They wrote it down in their heads the way troops do when they can tell a sentence will be useful when the floor shrinks and the noise spikes. By noon, Base 7 was running its first Kestrel showcase. The times weren't pretty. 90 seconds. A shaky 84. One team got under 80 only to realize they'd traded control for luck. The warrant officer's stopwatch didn't care about luck, and neither did Hartwell's eye from the rail. In the mess, the story kept moving but shed any hint of rivalry. It wasn't Army versus Navy anymore, it was people who had watched the room eat assumptions telling people who hadn't that the room always eats assumptions. In the motor pool, a young soldier ran his hand over a Humvee door and muttered, 69, like a target he didn't expect to hit but wanted to train toward. The armory felt it too. The clerk processed gear with the calm of someone who had decided the pace of the job should match the seriousness of the work. Forms that usually napped on a clipboard got inked and filed like the system had woken up a half step. Cross's team didn't hide. They ate in the open, trained on time, and showed up for the afternoon block ready to be the guys everyone watched, not to fail again, but to model how you carry a bruise without turning it into a limp. Doyle took extra reps on footwork, not because someone told him to, but because the mat had told him the truth and he finally believed it. Reddick asked for a second look at the junction throw. Matty gave him 3 corrections in 5 sentences and walked away before gratitude could turn the exchange into a moment. Keene ran slings through fingers until the motion lost its hitch, then taped the bad panel lip as a courtesy to the next run, not to himself. By evening chow, Kestrel drill had a life outside the bay. An instructor in the range shack drafted a 1-page note for tomorrow's leadership stand-up: don't teach fair fights. Teach finishes from bad starts. Hartwell read it, scratched a check mark, and added 1 sentence at the bottom: make the room the 5th actor. He didn't sign his name. He didn't need to. Out on the quad, the wind came up just enough to push dust across the concrete in thin sheets. Matty stepped through it without breaking stride, same pace as always, same economy, same refusal to waste motion on anything that didn't move the work forward. She didn't carry a stopwatch in her pocket or a nickname on her sleeve. She carried the habits that had written the minute nobody in Base 7 would forget. The base settled into night with a new angle in its posture. Not louder. Sharper. In the morning, the whistles would blow again, and the maze would wait with its usual lies and its reliable truths. The standard was on the floor now, not as a dare thrown at one branch or another, but as a quiet, unignorable fact: tools matter, but they don't decide. People do. And at Fort Ashland, from the catwalk to the mop bucket to the mess line, more people understood that than they had yesterday. And the understanding didn't stay in Base 7, it moved through Fort Ashland like a quiet current that you only notice when suddenly you're standing straighter and listening harder. The schedule filled with Kestrel blocks, not because someone made a poster, but because instructors saw what happened when a room stripped away excuses. In morning briefs, the stopwatch number got mentioned less, and the principles got mentioned more: start disadvantaged, own posture, break tails, manage tempo, finish clean. Teams rotated in from other corners of the base, some skeptical, some eager, all of them a little quieter when they stepped under the fluorescent buzz and smelled oil and dust. Cross's 4 didn't hide from any of it. They showed up early, walked lanes with recruits, and let the tape marks on the walls tell the truth. Doyle talked less and listened more, big hands tracing angles in the air as he practiced footwork that used to bore him. You could see him rehearse the throw in reverse, writing new muscle memory over the old bruise. Reddick lost the habit of chasing noise. He started calling holds before a bad rush could start, and for the first time you could imagine him teaching without performing. Keene took rear security like it was a job worth doing well, not a chore to pawn off, and his breathing finally matched the lanes instead of his nerves. Cross kept shouldering the quiet part of leadership, taking the looks, steering the reset, refusing to let pride bargain with reality. When a visiting platoon asked if they could see the exact run that started all this, Hartwell said no, because the point was never a replay, it was repeating the lesson under new variables until it lived in hands and feet, not in a story. He did, though, give them the same 5 lines he'd written on a pad: respect terrain, deny assumptions, manage tempo, force choices, finish clean. He read them out like he was reading the weather, and then he let the bay speak for itself. Maddie stayed in the background by habit, not hunger. She answered questions when they were real questions, fixed grip and balance with small nudges that didn't turn into moments, and left people with corrections they could own. When someone asked her for the trick, she said there wasn't one. Rooms reward attention and punish entitlement. That was it. She still walked perimeter at dusk, same pace, same circuit, same way she let the day bleed out of her shoes before the next one started. Sometimes she passed the observation deck and saw an instructor pausing at the rail the way Hartwell had, hands light, eyes on lines and corners like they were reading a map that hadn't existed a month ago. Sometimes she crossed the motor pool and caught a mechanic tracing a sling across a door seam, practicing the same mistake so he'd never make it by accident. Word slid past Fort Ashland. An email landed from a training cell 2 states over asking for container dimensions. Another from a Marine schoolhouse wanted the bullet points without the story. A joint seminar added a slide labeled Kestrel Parameters, stripped of names and patches, just tasks and time and the ugly geometry of disadvantage. You could feel the rivalry leach out of the telling. It stopped being Army versus Navy and started being people versus rooms, which is the only fight that matters when the plan snaps. In the mess, someone would say, 69, and someone else would answer, finish clean, and the talk would move on to who was running in the afternoon and whether the new lighting pattern changed anything at the South Bend. Hartwell didn't collect credit. He walked the catwalk sometimes and let the sound of boots on steel tell him whether a unit had learned to breathe. He kept his office door half open and his pen capped, because standards don't need speeches once the floor starts teaching. Late one evening, Cross caught up to Maddie by the armory. He didn't give a speech either. He just said, "We're better this week," like a report, not a plea. She nodded once. That was the whole exchange. The next morning a team beat 80 seconds without losing control, and nobody cheered, they just wrote the time down and circled the choices that made it possible. A week later, a different team failed hard and broke formation, and the debrief didn't mention pride. It mentioned corner integrity and breath control and the moment a room lied and someone listened. The maze does that. It keeps lying the same way until you learn to ignore the lie. By the end of the month, Fort Ashland carried itself different. Not louder. Sharper. People looked at tight spaces and asked better questions. The armory line moved with purpose instead of hurry. The motor pool tape stayed on bad edges because somebody decided the next crew should fight the room, not a burr. On a Friday night, the base exhaled the way bases do when the week is done, and base 7 went dark except for the security glow that paints a thin stripe on steel. Maddie climbed the catwalk alone and stood where Hartwell had stood on the day that started the talk. No audience. No whistle. Just the stacked corridors and the memory of footsteps that had learned too late what the space had been saying all along. She didn't take a victory lap. She let her hands rest on the rail and listened to the quiet until it filled her head with nothing. Some stories end with medals, some with banners. This one didn't need either. It had a floor you could walk and a standard you could meet, and that's more useful than applause. She left the deck the way she came, boots marking the grate in a rhythm as unremarkable as breath. Outside, the Texas night smelled like dust and diesel, and the sky was big enough to swallow the week whole. In the weeks that followed, the drill kept traveling without names attached to it. New units ran it wrong, then ran it better. Young troops who hadn't been there started repeating the same lines as if they'd seen them written on the walls: respect the room, don't chase anger, fix your feet, change your angle, finish clean. That's the part that lasts. Not the stopwatch, not the whispers, not the way a crowd leaned forward for an ending. The lesson sticks because rooms don't get tired and pride always does. At Fort Ashland, the air settled around that truth like it belonged there. If you walked past Bay 7 and didn't know the story, all you'd see was steel and rubber and bad lighting. If you did know it, you'd feel the edge sharpen in your chest. Either way, the doors would open the next day, the whistle would go up, and someone would step into a fight the room had been winning for years. Maybe they'd lose. Maybe they'd learn. Maybe they'd do both and come back better. That's the work. That's the ending you can use. And if anyone ever asks what changed, the answer is simple and enough: people stopped expecting the room to be fair, and they got good at finishing anyway.